Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
The world awaits Iran's response after the U.S. hit nuclear sites in the Islamic Republic, setting back Tehran's uranium enrichment capabilities and pushing the Middle East into uncharted territory. Oil pairs gains after the U.S. struck Iran's nuclear sites. The focus now on whether Iran will respond by blocking the Strait of Hormuz. Well, it's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai. Welcome to Horizons Middle East and Africa. Yet another monumental weekend in the Middle East with the U.S. striking those 3 nuclear facilities overnight on Saturday night. And the world now waiting for the reaction from Iran and how they are looking to retaliate. That's going to be the focus of our show the next hour. Let's just take a look at how some of the key markets are reacting to all of these developments in the Middle East. And you'll see, actually, as far as equity markets are concerned, limited reaction. S&P futures only down about 0.2%. Compare that to the day after the initial wave of attacks from Israel onto Iran exactly over a week ago. And then we saw S&P and the NASDAQ pulled down by more than 1.3%. So very muted compared to the price action that we got over a week ago. Asia Pacific, the handover is slightly more negative, though. You can see there many of those indices trading in the red. 1.1% is where the Asia Pacific index is trading, back to levels not seen since the beginning of June. And then clearly a lot of focus on the energy complex. Brent now just shy of $79 to 78.50 is where we're at, about 2% firmer on the day, though we did open up almost 6% higher. And since then, we've pulled back from some of those gains as it's become evident that there has been no actual physical disruption yet to energy supplies. The Strait of Hormuz, what happens there, potential disruption on shipping, all of those are elements that oil traders are keeping a close eye on. And then gold, interestingly enough, today also pairing back. So we're down about 0.1%. You would think in an environment like this that more money would be pouring into those safe havens, but that's not the case this morning. Gold is actually down about 0.1%. So markets, I would say the reaction has been somewhat moderate relative to the size of the political move that took place this weekend with the U.S. launching those strikes on those nuclear sites in Iran. Now, data, looking ahead today, we're going to get a lot of the PMI data from European countries in addition to the U.S. as well. So let's not forget about some of the data that markets will be watching out for. Interestingly enough, services and manufacturing PMIs rose in May, and so the numbers seem to be doing okay from a survey standpoint in the U.S. So keep an eye out for that later today. We'll set the tone for anyone who's been watching out for some of the data that's coming through, both from Europe and from the U.S., as we speak about the geopolitical tensions over here. Now, the U.S. strikes on Iran have sharply raised geopolitical risk in a global economy already facing severe uncertainty over President Trump's trade war. The world is now watching for the response from Tehran after the U.S. deployed bunker buster bombs to strike the heart of the regime's nuclear sites, claiming it has now significantly set back those uranium enrichment capabilities. But independent analysis has yet to confirm Trump's claims. Images appear to show a large support building on the Fordo site remaining undamaged. In a social media post, Trump has rejected questions about the effectiveness of the U.S. strikes, saying monumental damage was done and obliteration is an accurate term. That is a quote. Meanwhile, Iran says it's the U.S. that decided not to take the diplomatic path.
The world must not forget that it was the United States which, in the midst of a process to forge a diplomatic outcome, betrayed diplomacy.
Bloomberg's executive editor for Middle East, North Africa and Russia, Stuart Livingstone-Wallace, joins us now. Well, that was quite the intensification over the weekend. What do you think happened? Because on Friday we were reporting that Trump was potentially considering giving diplomacy a chance, a 2-week window, so to speak. And then, of course, 24 hours later, they launched these strikes on those nuclear facilities.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent classic Trump in that, don't look at what he says, look at what he does. And we've seen repeated examples of that where he'll give, theoretical deadlines and they'll come and go. And other times there'll be a deadline and then he goes much earlier. So I think, ultimately here, I suspect the decision was taken some time ago. Now, strictly speaking, it was within the 2-week window, so he wasn't entirely making it up as you go along. But I think they saw an opportunity there. Israel had basically taken out pretty much all the air defences, and what was really interesting was when the Pentagon had its briefing yesterday, they said there was virtually no resistance. In fact, I think they may even have said there was no resistance. So there was an opportunity, and they took it.
Yeah. How are you expecting, or how is the world expecting Iran to retaliate? Because the U.S. framed this as a targeted strike. Do you get a targeted response then from Iran?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's perfectly in line with what Iran has always done. Ultimately here, the goal is the continuation of the regime, whatever that takes. And that's either economic or military or by any other aspect. So I think what you're going to see here, there's a range of options open to them. I don't think there's going to be some big cataclysmic moment that, perhaps some people are anticipating, because, again, the US has shown that if they take that option, the consequences will be very dire. They are in an incredibly weak position, both militarily, economically, I would argue, even internally within the country. They're not in a strong position.
You say that the survival of the regime is paramount to the regime at this point in time. Is that why you think it is perhaps unlikely that they may go down the route of disrupting the Strait of Hormuz? Because they also need the Strait of Hormuz to get their oil exports out to their main buyers, and one of them obviously China.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And I don't want to say that Hormuz is overstated as an issue. They absolutely can do it for a short period of time. What I point to is history. So back in the 1980s, while the Iran-Iraq war was going on, they had mined the Persian Gulf. They hit a US ship. The response was 2 Iranian oil platforms sunk, 3 Iranian warships sunk, 2 aircraft lost. The lesson they learned from that is, by and large, don't poke the bear, because the consequences are really, really bad for you.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of their oil storage is actually sitting on that Karg island, which also would be susceptible in a situation like that. Stuart, thank you very much for the context. That was Stuart Livingstone-Wallace, Bloomberg's executive editor for Middle East, North Africa, and Russia. Thank you very much. Now, let's bring in Alan Eyre, a former senior U.S. diplomat and distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute. Good to have you on. Thank you very much for staying late. Let me just start out by asking you, President Trump framed this, and Defense Secretary as well, as a sort of one-off strike, a targeted strike specifically at nuclear facilities, not targeted at Iranian civilians, and also adding that the U.S. does not want to get involved in an open-ended war. What is the chances that this actually does become a protracted war and an open-ended war that the U.S. gets embroiled in?
Well, first, Jomana, thank you for having me on. I think that's more likely if Iran responds aggressively to the U.S. attacks on the nuclear infrastructures. But as your previous guest just said, I think that's unlikely. I think Iran, at least heretofore, has had relatively reserved and risk-averse strategic decision-making in situations like this. Now, the people who are making decisions has changed over the last 10 days because Israel killed almost all of them. So there's a new set of people making decisions, and they might be less risk-averse. But Supreme Leader Khamenei is traditionally very cautious. So I would be surprised if Iran responds against the U.S. in a big way, at least in the short term. I note that Supreme Leader Khamenei put something out on social media, X, recently, this morning, which is his first social messaging after the attack. And in it, he says the punishment of Israel will continue. He doesn't even mention the U.S. So I think, as your previous guest said, they don't want to bait the bear for the time being.
What could a restrained response look like, though?
Again, I don't think they want to attack any U.S. forces in countries, Gulf allies, because that will also turn Gulf allies against them. They could try something against naval ships, but again, they're so militarily outmatched. And right now, they're still dealing with continuing Israeli bombing. So it seems to me more likely that they're going to hold off, and then they can do a whole target set. They could fire some rockets at something that has a U.S. flag on it. But as I said, I think right now their main instinct is to avoid drawing in the U.S. for subsequent attacks.
One other potential action they could take, and I thought this was interesting because it's something that the Iranian foreign minister brought up yesterday in the press conference that he gave, was potentially leaving the non-proliferation treaty. Obviously, a final decision hasn't been made, but should they go down that route, what would be the consequences, do you think?
Oh, I think that's quite likely. That's not a tactical response to kinetic action by Israel or the U.S., but certainly longer term, I think it's quite possible, indeed likely, they'll pull out of the NPT. The foreign minister, Arakchi, has basically said to the international community, what's the good of being an NPT member if no one is going to condemn Israel or the United States for these attacks? What would be the consequences of Iran withdrawing from the NPT? Drastically reduced visibility into their program, drastically reduced transparency, and when you combine that with what I would presume to be a possibly increased desire by Iran to actually weaponize and get a nuclear weapon, that's a very, very bad move by Iran to pull out of the NPT.
Alan, do you think diplomacy is dead at this point, or is there still a window of opportunity for the Iranians to return back to the negotiating table with the U.S. right now?
I think for the short term, diplomacy is dead. Yes, totally. They've said Iran has said they're not going to return to diplomacy as long as they're being attacked. Israel certainly doesn't want to try diplomacy because they've said their goal is essentially regime change. You know, Benjamin Netanyahu told Senator Graham earlier today, we cannot tolerate the Iranian regime, or words to that effect. The U.S. seems to be, for the time being, fine with Israel continuing its attacks. Iran would like to resume diplomacy just to get a ceasefire, but still they've shown no indication that they'll change their red lines. And all the international fora that we're familiar with, G7, EU, IAEA, the UN, are powerless because the only three people who can change the facts on the ground, three countries, are Iran, Israel, and the United States.
Let me just bring it back to something you said about Israel. I mean, they've never, I guess, explicitly said that regime change is the goal. What they've explicitly said is they want to ensure that Iran does not go on to develop a nuclear program, and they also want to severely degrade their defense and military capabilities. And they're in the process of doing that with those two stated objectives. Now, at what point do you think Israel will have deemed the actions that they have committed so far to be consistent with achieving those objectives, i.e., what stops Israel from getting involved in an open-ended war?
Actually, I think that Israel has been relatively explicit about what they call not necessarily regime change, because they don't have a new regime in their back pocket, but destabilizing and incapacitating this regime. Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, as you have said, that they want to eliminate the nuclear program, eliminate Iran's ability to produce missiles, and eliminate their axis of terror. And both he and the Israeli defense minister have said that they wish to destabilize or incapacitate the Iranian government. And I mean, was it Prime Minister Netanyahu 2 or 3 days ago went on a very prominent expatriate Iranian TV station that beams into Iran and basically invited the Iranian people to rise up. This is one of the reasons why I don't think diplomacy will work, because Israel, which is driving facts on the ground, wants to keep going.
That's, I guess, an interesting way to leave it. Thank you so much for your insights today on the show, Alan. We really appreciate it. Alan Eyre, a former senior U.S. diplomat and distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute. Thank you. Now, still ahead, we'll assess the geopolitical risks and their impacts on the global economy with Commercial Bank of Dubai as investors await Iran's response to the U.S. strikes on its nuclear sites. This is Bloomberg. Oil prices and the dollar have paired in early advance as investors await Iran's response to the U.S. strike on its nuclear sites. Joining us is Deepak Mehra, Chief Economist at Commercial Bank of Dubai. Deepak, my colleague Dan Curtis put out a side-by-side comparison of some of the key metrics around the world the day after Israel's strikes on Iran last week and today. And it's very clear from the price action this morning that the reaction has been a lot more muted than it was 1 week ago. A week ago, you had the S&P, NASDAQ down more than 1.1%. You had a big spike in gold. Obviously, oil is a different scenario. But why do you think the market reaction today is more muted than it was a week ago? Because now you have the U.S. involvement.
Yeah. Good morning, Jumana. Actually, it's very interesting. There has been a lot of worry and concerns about oil supplies, oil and gas supply through our waterways. But if you take a perspective and you step back and look at our waterways, they're probably the most guarded waterways in the world today. So I think the market looks at that, investors are looking at that, and they don't expect really constraint to the supplies coming from this region. Very unlikely. So that concern, in the spur of the moment, in the beginning, it was really worrying. If you take a perspective, it is not.
Yeah, and that concern is showing up in oil volatility. You see it in options pricing about oil, but you're not seeing it with equity volatility. Is it a case that you think oil volatility is overpriced or that equity volatility is underpriced relative to some of these risks?
So I think oil volatility is overpriced. From early May, we've seen oil prices rise almost 30%, more than 30% now. And today they are trading almost at the same level as Jan. So a lot of bad news, a lot of concern is already baked into the oil prices today. And I don't think this is going to escalate further. And that's what the markets are looking at. As far as equities are concerned, equities are taking cues from other stuff. I mean, look at the FOMC outcome, which was quite dovish. They upgraded their outlook for inflation, but yet are projecting 2 rate cuts. Then a voting member, Chris Waller, came and said that July rate cuts are possibly on the table. You look at earnings, the bar has been set low once again for the coming quarter. So mid-July onwards, we'll start seeing, again, companies probably beating their expectations. And then you look at the economy overall. There is a slowdown, but there's no recession coming.
Yeah.
So equities are taking cues, positive cues from there. Oil has a lot of bad news already priced in. It may not get that bad. So things may stabilize.
I would say you sound relatively optimistic about the outlook for at least U.S. equities from here.
Yes, I am. And for the reasons I just mentioned, I think if we get a dip here, these dips are buying opportunities for investors. And they've been waiting for a dip for a while. Yes, they have a lot of concerns to now grapple with. We had trade and tariff worries, and now we have the second worry about geopolitics. I think this will pass. History has shown in the last 50 years that oil price spikes because of geopolitical events do not persist.
That's true.
And therefore, all that is going to pass.
Or if there is a spike, it tends to last a couple of months before things revert back to normal. So it's more of a trader's market as opposed to an investor's market. The dollar has been interesting. Over the course of the past week, it's actually jumped 1%. And this is the same USD that people had started to question over the course of April, May. Remember, people were asking about this theme of U.S. exceptionalism and whether it had run its course. But I guess in really strenuous times, there is really only one safe haven that people want to own, apart from gold.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So I think, again, short dollar was a hugely consensus trade. So I think everyone was shorting dollar. But when it comes to events like these, you will see that those shorts will get caught. And you could see spike up in dollar. It'll prove to be the safe haven once again. It's lost 10% year to date. It's, I think, overdone. It has been consolidating for a couple of weeks. And the real safe haven, again, turns out to be the US dollar and treasuries, by the way, and not gold. We saw gold falling 2% last week.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, that's a matter of valuation because
Yes.
the USD had been underperforming for most of this year and gold was making record high after record high. So I guess at the end of the day, investors still have to assess where the value is. I do just want to ask you about U.S. Treasuries, though, because once again, the focus has shifted towards Trump's big, beautiful bill, the tax bill, and what that's going to mean. And, you know, there's a big consensus out there that believes that it's adding to the deficit without necessarily adding a lot to the U.S.'s productive underlying capabilities. So ultimately, is that not bearish for the long-term U.S. Treasuries and the long end part of the curve?
I think we have to listen to what Scott Bessent said. He said one big, beautiful bill is not the only part of the equation. The other part of the equation is tariffs. And we've already seen tariff income from revenue from April and May rising to levels which are more consistent to about $300 billion run rate per annum. So when you add the tariff income, which has already started kicking in, with the deficits which are going to increase, they by and large match up with each other.
No, not really, because the CBO estimate that the deficit is going to increase by more than $2 trillion over the next 5 years.
Yes, it's about $2.8 trillion, $3 trillion over the next 10 years. The tariff income is about $300 billion additional, even if we take a base case of 10 to 15%. So over a period of time, they match out. And I think that's the perspective that markets are taking and not getting too worried about the one big, beautiful bill here.
Interesting. Okay. Deepak, very good to talk to you. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Deepak Mehra, Chief Economist at Commercial Bank of Dubai. Well, coming up, the global shipping industry on high alert with warnings that Tehran could retaliate against commercial vessels following U.S. airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities. That and more ahead. This is Bloomberg.
I think that would be suicidal, Kristen, for the Iranians themselves. I mean, their entire economy runs through the Strait of Hormuz. If they want to destroy their own economy and cause disruptions in the world, I think that would be their decision. But why would they do that? I don't think it makes any sense. I don't think that it makes sense for them or for anybody else. What would make sense is for them to come to the negotiating table, to actually give up their nuclear weapons program over the long term.
We have a window of opportunity to return to dialogue and diplomacy. If that window closes, violence and destruction could reach unthinkable levels, and the global non-proliferation regime, as we know it, could crumble and fall.
The bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities by the United States marks a perilous turn in a region that is already reeling. From the outset of the crisis, I have repeatedly condemned any military escalation in the Middle East. The people of the region cannot endure another cycle of destruction.
Officials from Washington, Tehran, and the United Nations reacting to the U.S. strikes on Iran. And coming up, following those U.S. strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, we discuss the mood in Israel as well as the impact on oil markets. This is Bloomberg.
Iran's key nuclear enrichment facilities have been completely and totally obliterated.
The world awaits Iran's response after the U.S. hits nuclear sites in the Islamic Republic, setting back Tehran's uranium enrichment capabilities and pushing the Middle East into uncharted territory. Oil pairs gains after the U.S. struck Iran's nuclear sites. The focus now on whether Iran will respond by blocking the Strait of Hormuz. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Jumana Bersachi in Dubai, kicking off the second hour of the second half of the show, I should say, taking a look at how markets are faring, because earlier on we were talking about the rather muted reaction we're witnessing across global equities. S&P futures only down about 0.2%, and you will recall that the day after Israel launched those first set of attacks on Iran about a week ago, thereafter we had a huge nosedive in risk sentiment. S&P that day ended the day about 1.3% weaker, so relatively muted compared to what we saw after the initial wave of attacks. Asia Pacific, though, the handover from most of these Asian markets pretty negative today, down 1.2%, so a lot more negative than the S&P is implying. Brent obviously in focus. We are now up 1.8%, getting closer and closer to $80. We did open up almost 6% firmer this morning, and clearly there, all traders keeping a close eye for any physical disruption that may come as a response to Iran retaliating, and a lot of talk about the potential closure or disruptions on the Strait of Hormuz. We're going to talk about that shortly. And then gold, interestingly enough, is actually down 0.2%. We were just speaking about that with Deepak Mehra on the show, and he was saying that maybe as a function of the fact that gold has rallied so much already this year, going from record high to record high, investors really finding it difficult to pull the plug at this point, given how lofty these valuations are already. A quick look at PMIs, namely because we've got global PMI numbers coming out from European nations in addition to the U.S. later today. And you can see that services and PMI manufacturing numbers actually rose in May. And so does tell you that even though there are some signs that the U.S. economy is beginning to slow down, the most recent survey data has actually held up. So again, that has knock-on effects for the FOMC and rates decisions, especially given last week the Fed chair sounded slightly more hawkish on those inflation forecasts. So as long as the data holds up, perhaps investors may have to be a bit more patient about the prospect of imminent rate cuts coming through from the Fed. Now, back to our top story. Israel woke up to a new reality Sunday after President Trump confirmed that the U.S. had bombed Iran's main 3 nuclear sites. The attack has been lauded across Israel as a historic symbol of unprecedented cooperation with the U.S. However, now the concern is about how Iran will respond. Israeli President Isaac Herzog commended Trump's actions, but denies his country has pulled the U.S. into a war.
We made clear throughout that we are not dragging America into a war, and we are leaving it to the decision of the head of, the President of the United States and his team, because it had to do with America's national security interest, period.
But UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres calls this a perilous turn of events.
The bombing of Iranian nuclear facilities by the United States marks a perilous turn in a region that is already reeling. From the outset of the crisis, I have repeatedly condemned any military escalation in the Middle East. The people of the region cannot endure another cycle of destruction.
For more, we're joined by Bloomberg's Dan Williams in Jerusalem. Dan, walk us through how the Israeli public has responded to the U.S. military intervention over the weekend.
Good morning, Jumana. Yes, well, this was a dramatic weekend, one of historic proportions in Israel as elsewhere in the region and in the world, especially countries that have a stake in this part of the world. And Israelis, I would say, this is to judge by everything from television panelists to the people I've shared bomb shelters with during Iranian retaliatory missile attacks, appear to be relieved, jubilant, astonished at the fact that the world's great power, the United States, did intervene finally, and using its firepower for what appears to have been a knockout blow, at least as described by President Trump and by his staff, to the Iranian nuclear program. Of course, the question is whether it was a knockout blow, and I think what you're going to see today is the discourse shifting to one of BDA. That's a refrain you'll be hearing a lot of, battle damage assessment, whether indeed it was a knockout blow, whether indeed the damage was enough to end any credible work at those sites and effectively allow Israel to pack up and say that the war is over. The main threat, what is described as the main threat to his existence going back 30 decades, has now been dealt with conclusively.
I thought it was interesting the Israeli Prime Minister gave a televised address yesterday where he said Israel is very close to reaching goals in Iran, but will also avoid a war of attrition. How should we be reading those comments, Dan?
Well, it's worth keeping in mind that the countries are separated by something like 1,000 miles of territory, I think 3 international borders. Iran is something like 70 times the size of Israel. There really is an asymmetry here in terms of disposition, geography, military standing. So for all the virtuosity of Israeli forces here, I don't think they could afford to sustain fighting in the long run, something akin to what we've seen in the last 20 months in Gaza, in Lebanon, in Syria, which are neighboring countries or neighboring territories. So the Israelis are looking logistically at this. I think they're also signaling to the American public, those Americans who are wondering whether this is a repeat of 2003 in Iraq, that this was a one-time deal for Israel and for the United States, that perhaps the U.S. role has begun and ended with this airstrike, and that Israel, the country most involved in this, the U.S. ally, is really also trying to wrap things up as soon as it believes that its goals have been achieved, and those goals may be achieved very soon.
Yeah, well, we'll be keeping a close eye on that BDA, as you say, the battle damage assessment in the coming days to see just how much damage has been sustained at those nuclear sites. Thank you, Bloomberg's Dan Williams in Jerusalem. Now, oil is paring gains after surging at the open following the U.S. attack on Iranian nuclear sites. Traders are worried about potential disruptions to energy supply, particularly through the Strait of Hormuz. About a fifth of global crude passes through this waterway. U.S. Secretary Marco Rubio called any move to close it, quote, suicidal.
Well, I encourage the Chinese government in Beijing to call them about that because they heavily depend on the Straits of Hormuz for their oil. If they do that, it'll be another terrible mistake. It's economic suicide for them if they do it. And we retain options to deal with that. But other countries should be looking at that as well. It would hurt other countries' economies a lot worse than ours.
For more, we're joined by Stephen Sachinski, who leads our energy coverage in Asia. So much going around about the Strait of Hormuz and the potential closure of the Strait of Hormuz. It is important to remind viewers that no decision has been taken. There's been no physical disruption as of yet. But I think also, Stephen, it is also worth reminding people as well that Iran doesn't have any legal authority to close the waterway. They don't actually have any legal basis to do it. So what are the ways that they could disrupt shipping going through that strait? What are their options?
Right. Often, you've seen Tehran come out and say that they're going to close the Strait of Hormuz, and they've never been able to do so. They share a border with Oman. It is a large waterway that is challenging to theoretically close. Now, there are some different options that they have at their disposal. They could start to strike the ships going through, ships with ties with the United States, ships with ties with Israel, Western allies. This is something that they have done previously, and it is something that could slow down trade. It could make ship owners think twice before sending their vessel through the strait. It is something that could increase insurance rates. Already you're seeing the price of renting a vessel jump about 60% for types of crude tankers have gone up for freight rates. So already you're seeing that kind of risk premium come in there. It hasn't happened yet, but it is something that is being watched. You could also see more mines in the region being used. This was an issue in 2019. The U.S. said that 2 ships going through the strait, nearby the strait, were hit by mines that they say were from Iran. Iran disputes this, but it is something that, again, could be used there. Or they could just use their patrol ships to basically harass vessels, tell them to come to Iran's border, tell them to slow down. This could force vessels to kind of move together in pacts with Western ships, military ships and destroyers to essentially go through the passage safely. This could slow down deliveries and cause delays, but it's not necessarily closing the strait per se.
Yeah, but shipping costs have already shot up over the course of the last week in anticipation of it being trickier to get through the strait. Are we seeing actually any ships turning around or avoiding that route altogether?
You know, the issue with the Strait of Hormuz is, unlike the Red Sea, which is one of the conduits through the Suez Canal, there are no other options if you want to get to Saudi oil or Qatari LNG. But we have seen a few ships in the last 24 hours. 2 large oil carriers had turned around. It's unclear whether they're doing this because they're going to go to a different location. Maybe they're going to an anchorage to just wait until they're closer for their loading date. That's something that, it's just a precaution. We've also seen Qatar tell LNG vessels that are coming nearby to wait until a day before they're loading, to wait outside of the strait, so that if there is, again, a precautionary measure, if there is conflict, that they don't get stuck within on the other side of the strait or could be potentially targeted. But all that together, these are just a very few amount of ships. Overall, most traffic appears to be continuing as normal. And that's something that the oil market's watching very closely. And that's why, despite the jump in oil prices we saw earlier today to almost 6%, we're only up about 1.8, 1.9%, paired some of those gains, because we're not seeing any disruption yet or any retaliation, large-scale retaliation from Iran in response to the U.S. strikes over the weekend.
Yeah, let's see what happens. Stephen Soshinsky, who leads our Asia energy coverage, thank you so much for that. And now, for more on this, geopolitical considerations, Julia Roknifard, senior lecturer, School of Law and Governance at Taylor's University, Malaysia, joins us now. Julia, thanks for joining our show. Earlier on, we were speaking to Alan Eyre, former U.S. diplomat, and he was saying diplomacy is dead. Do you support that view as well, or do you think there is still potential, a sliver of hope, that the diplomatic channels can be revived again?
Maybe at some point, but not as of currently. Iran decisively said that it's not going to go into any diplomacy. And even before the U.S. strikes, Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi went to Geneva to only listen to what the European countries have to say and then possibly pass the message to the United States. But then even they were probably unaware, while talking to Iran, that the strike is going to take place. So I don't see how we can have amount of trust, a shred of trust, in fact, necessary to at least think about the possibility of any diplomacy at this point. So for now, I think we'll still be looking at a battleground where Iran will continue to retaliate against Israel and possibly, as your colleagues just highlighted, possibly resorting to some other measures like blockading the Strait of Hormuz.
Now, the U.S. administration painted the attacks on the nuclear sites as a resounding success. Trump used the word obliterated. Of course, at this point, it's unclear exactly how much damage was sustained. It seems like there was a certain amount of damage, but not perhaps the fatal blow that the U.S. were looking for. Do you think that these attacks will actually maybe lead to the Iranians to harden their resolve to continue along with their nuclear ambitions as opposed to abandon them?
To your question, yes, for sure. And of course, it's all a political talk that those nuclear sites were obliterated. We've seen that Iran was able to evacuate, to take away the materials, the centrifuges, the enriched uranium out of those enrichment facilities. So it's potentially that the United States hit at the empty facilities already. And that's why we're also not seeing a contamination, although the experts predicted also that there is not supposed to be that much contamination, even if uranium was to be on those nuclear sites. But they've taken it out. And the matter is, with the possession of knowledge that Iran has, is about rebuilding the facilities, which is, of course, it's about investment, but it could be rebuilt in pretty much a short term, especially with the centrifuges, the advanced centrifuges that Iran currently has, the amount of the enriched uranium that Iran has. So it could be rebuilt, and it's not going to take what's going on lying down. It's still going to formulate a response both to Israel and to the United States. But then again, I think it's more going to focus on Israel at this point, taking it as a probably a smaller target than to take on the United States and incur dragging the United States full on into the Middle Eastern war.
Yeah. There's been so much talk and speculation around Iranian regime change, and even President Trump posted about it yesterday on Truth Social that there should be leadership that makes Iran great again. But I think most people agree that it's very difficult to bring about an external change of regime. But isn't it also true that this current regime is the weakest it's been, perhaps, since it came into power in 1979, and therefore the very weakness of this origin of the so-called axis of evil around the region, or axis of resistance around the region, is going to have consequences on the region because it's not the force it once was?
Yes, this is very true. We've seen the weakening of the regime in the Islamic Republic. We've seen the rise of discontent in the country, the protests of the past years, over and over again, with the latest protest of the truck drivers. So it has been aggravating. However, those who think that there is a bright possibility of a regime change as a result of military strikes do not study history very well. And it surprises me how recent that history is, that you still would not expect people to rally around the flag. Yes, it might be not of the nature like people rallied up during the Iran-Iraq war, the newly independent country and the foreign aggression supported by the whole world. So it's us against the whole world. Maybe there is not such a drive, but at the same time, it is still an attack on the motherland that is happening. And it doesn't mean that people would rally around the leadership, some of which, as we know, is dead, but that it is so straightforward that it's going to lead to a regime change. I don't think so. Maybe if Iran is reduced by this bombing campaign to something like Yemen or Libya, then we could be talking about even a bigger chaos after the regime change. But at this point, I don't think as the successor to the last Shah of Iran, Reza Pahlavi, called people on to come into the streets. I don't see that happening at all. It would be preposterous to expect that.
Yeah. Julia Roknifard, Senior Lecturer, School of Law and Governance at Taylor's University, Malaysia. Really good to have your insight on the show today. Thank you so much. Now, coming up, American and European airlines pause flights to destinations in the Persian Gulf as tensions in the region escalate. Details next. This is Bloomberg. U.S. and European airlines have begun pausing flights to destinations in the Persian Gulf. Joining us now is Bloomberg's Nilan Rashdan, who covers Middle East aerospace for us. So this came as a bit of a surprise, especially for those of us who actually live in the UAE. It feels unprecedented to hear of European and Asian airlines halting flights. So how widespread are these flight disruptions, Lean?
So this is the first time this has happened in over 20 months of aggression. It is unprecedented. Worries have never reached this far. It's always been contained to Jordan, Iraq, Iran, Lebanon. But this is the first time we're seeing airlines cancel flights to the Gulf. They've canceled, several flights have been canceled to Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE. Airlines are worried for their crew, for their passengers, about the region. And the U.S. has issued several warnings for people in countries like Qatar and in Bahrain. So while a majority of the foreign carriers and almost all of the Western carriers have canceled flights to, let's say, Dubai, the Emirates Fly Dubai are still operating, Qatar Airways is still operating, Gulf Air and Bahrain is still operating. So these cancellations might be a fraction of the overall number of flights that are departing from the Persian Gulf or arriving in the Persian Gulf. They're still quite significant. The fact that all these carriers are canceling their flights here is really new and unprecedented.
Yeah. Lean, do we have any understanding of how long these flight disruptions will last? Do we know?
So we know several carriers have different timelines. Some of them have canceled flights till the end of the month. British Airways is doing it day by day. They're waiting to see what happens. So today we'll find out if flights will be canceled for the day, tonight, and then tomorrow. So it's really just waiting and seeing. For the Levant, most of the flights are canceled till the end of the month, till the end of next month, and even going into September. For the Gulf, some of them are for next week, but then we just have to wait and see day by day. The airlines are trying to be very careful and take into account everything that happens.
Yeah, I would also just draw the distinction between the airlines that have halted those flights versus the flagship local airlines, which seem to be still operating, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, really, the airspace isn't closed, so there's no reason for these airlines, and we've not seen any dangerous or any signs of the war in the Gulf. So there's no specific reason for them to halt their flights. And also these countries live off of tourism. We have a lot of expats. So it's not an easy decision for an airline like Emirates or Qatar Airways to halt flights. So those will probably keep continuing unless airspace is closed.
Lean, thank you so much for joining us from Amman today. Lean Al-Rashdan on the latest. Now, several close U.S. allies are urging a return to the negotiating table following American strikes on Iran. Meanwhile, Iran's foreign minister says Washington crossed a very big red line and the time for diplomacy is over. It comes as NATO foreign ministers are set to meet this week in The Hague. For more, Bloomberg's Oliver Crook joins us now. Let's start maybe with the international reaction to these strikes, the U.S. strikes on Iran. How likely is it that we're going to get a united front from NATO in the coming days?
Well, listen, the line that NATO has had and many of the allies of the United States throughout this last sort of weekend has been to basically come back to the negotiating table, de-escalate the situation. I mean, that this is a situation that will only be resolved through diplomacy, not military action. That is really broadly the sentiment we've got, generally speaking, from the international community across the world, really no matter where most people sit. That being said, we haven't had a reaction yet to the sort of truth that Donald Trump posted about 7 hours ago, where he was talking about, regime change, though politically incorrect a term he says it would be. If the current Iranian regime is not making Iran great again, why wouldn't there be regime change? These are the sorts of comments that may garner some different reactions from a number of world leaders. But listen, the most outspoken have been, for example, China, who came and said that basically condemning the strikes, calling them a serious violation of international law. We also heard from the Russians. We should say the Iranian foreign minister is in Moscow today to meet with Vladimir Putin. We heard from Dmitry Medvedev, the deputy head of Putin's Security Council, saying that several countries were prepared to supply Tehran with nuclear weapons. We should say that Medvedev has been sort of one of the more hyperbolic, outspoken people within the sort of Russian administration throughout the conflict in Ukraine, so maybe not taking everything he says literally, but again, talking about sort of escalatory measures. As far as the EU is concerned, Ursula von der Leyen, they basically have all been saying that Iran should never be permitted to get a nuclear bomb. This is sort of tacit, I guess, endorsement for what the Trump administration has done. But remember, Jumana, the Europeans can only be so critical of Donald Trump as they await for him to arrive here in The Hague for the NATO meeting in just a couple of days.
Yeah. Has the situation in Iran overshadowed the conflict or the war that's going on in Ukraine?
Absolutely. I mean, you don't hear anything about it. We've been talking about a lot of strikes that have been happening over Ukraine over the last week, some of the most aggressive that have happened since the beginning of the war 3 years ago. So it is absolutely a frontal concern for everybody here in NATO. And we should say, front and center, there's also a question about whether the United States will draw down some of its troops that are stationed within Europe. There are about 85,000 U.S. troops and personnel within Europe. If the attention is going to be more towards the Pacific, which we know is the Trump administration's goal, is the attention also going to be going to the Middle East? That will mean troops will have to come out of here and to sort of release the deterrent that exists here within Europe that is provided by the United States.
Bloomberg's Oliver Crook in The Hague. Looking forward to your coverage this week. Well, that was it for Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jumana Versace in Dubai. Stay with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.